I'm about to reveal a secret I've kept for years. I'm Amelia, a city girl who once dreamed of a peaceful life in the countryside. But what I ended up living was a story straight out of a soap opera. Let me start from the beginning because every detail is crucial to understanding how I got to where I am now. It all began 5 years ago when I met Richard at a county fair. I was working as an event organizer, and he was there representing his family's farm. Our eyes met amidst the tractors and stalls of organic produce, and it felt like the world stopped for a moment. Richard was tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that lit up his entire face. I approached his booth under the guise of sampling some of his products, and we ended up talking for hours. We fell in love quickly. Richard was different from any man I had ever been with. He had a passion for the land and a way of seeing life that captivated me completely. 6 months into our relationship, he proposed under a starry sky at his farm. I didn't hesitate for a second to say yes. We married in an intimate ceremony at the village chapel near the farm. I was radiant in my white dress, surrounded by wildflowers, and with the love of my life by my side. I remember the proud look in Jacob's eyes, Richard's father, as he gave us his blessing. At that moment, I felt like I had not only found my love but also a new family. The first few months on the farm were like a dream. I fell in love with rural life, with the sunrises over the fields, and with the smell of fresh earth after the rain. Richard taught me how to ride a horse, milk cows, and even drive the tractor. I helped out where I could, learning the family business and trying to fit into this new life. Jacob, my father-in-law, was a great help in my adjustment. He was a man in his early 50s, widowed for some time, with a wisdom that only years of working the land could give. He taught me the secrets of his garden, how to predict the weather by looking at the sky, and shared countless stories about the farm and his family. We spent hours talking as we worked together, and over time, he became a friend and confidant. However, as time passed, I began to notice changes in Richard. The long hours of work on the farm left him exhausted, and we spent less and less time together. Our conversations were limited to practical matters about the farm, and the romantic evenings under the stars became scarce. I tried to talk to him about my feelings, but he always had an excuse. The harvest, the animals, the bills to pay. I felt increasingly lonely and abandoned, missing the connection we had at the beginning, that spark that had made me leave everything for him. I started seeking solace in my conversations with Jacob. He always had time to listen, to offer a kind word or wise advice. I don't know exactly when my feelings for Jacob began to change. Maybe it was that afternoon when he found me crying in the barn and hugged me, offering the comfort I so desperately needed. Or perhaps it was during those nights when Richard would come home late, and Jacob and I would have dinner together, sharing laughs and memories. What I do know is that, little by little, I began to see Jacob with different eyes. I felt guilty for these thoughts, but I couldn't stop them. Jacob was attentive, caring, and made me feel valued. I compared his treatment with Richard's growing indifference, and my heart became increasingly divided. One night, after a particularly intense argument with Richard about his lack of attention, I went out for a walk to clear my mind. My steps took me to the old oak tree at the edge of the property where I often went to think. To my surprise, Jacob was there, gazing at the stars. I sat down beside him in silence, letting the tears fall down my face. Without saying a word, Jacob put his arm around me, offering the comfort I so desperately needed. I looked up and our eyes met. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly we were kissing under the moonlight. It was a kiss loaded with conflicting emotions: passion, guilt, desire, and fear. When we pulled apart, we both knew we had crossed a line we shouldn't have crossed. We looked at each other in silence, aware of the gravity of what had just happened. "This is wrong," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "You're my son's wife." "I know," I replied, feeling the tears well up again. "But I can't deny what I feel." That night marked the beginning of a clandestine relationship that would last for months. We met in secret, stealing moments behind Richard's back. The guilt ate away at me, but at the same time, the moments with Jacob were the only times I felt truly alive. Richard remained absorbed in his work, seemingly oblivious to what was happening under his own roof. Or at least that's what we thought. The truth is, our guilt made us careless, and rumors began to circulate among the farm workers. It was Noah, one of the oldest employees on the farm, who finally decided to speak to Richard. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the sound of a car speeding up the driveway. Richard stormed in, his face contorted with rage and his eyes bloodshot. "Is it true?" he shouted, grabbing me by the shoulders. "Is what Noah said true?" I couldn't respond. The words stuck in my throat as I watched the world we had built crumble before my eyes. My silence was all the confirmation Richard needed. What followed was an explosion of screaming, crying, and accusations. Jacob came into the kitchen, drawn in by the commotion, and the situation escalated. Father and son clashed, saying things that could never be taken back. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as I not only destroyed my marriage, but also the relationship between a father and his son. That night, Richard packed his bags and left the farm. He didn't say where he was going, only that he couldn't stay under the same roof as us. I watched him leave with a broken heart, knowing that I was responsible for his pain. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Jacob and I tried to continue our relationship, but the weight of what we had done was too heavy. Every corner of the farm reminded me of Richard, and every look from the workers was filled with judgment. I felt trapped in a nightmare from which I could not wake up. Finally, after weeks of agony, the divorce papers arrived. Richard had mailed them, not even bothering to come in person. I signed them with shaking hands, knowing that I was putting an end to what had once been my life's dream. Guilt and shame consumed me. I could not look at Jacob without thinking of the damage we had done. Our relationship, which had once felt like an escape, now felt like a prison. I realized that, despite my feelings for him, our affair had been a mistake from the start. One morning I made the hardest decision of my life. I told Jacob that I was leaving, that I could no longer stay on the farm. He tried to convince me to stay, saying we could get through this together, but I knew it was impossible. I needed to get away from it all, to find myself again. With a heavy heart and a suitcase full of regrets, I left the farm that had been my home for the past few years. I had no plan, just the certainty that I needed to escape, to find a place where I could breathe without feeling the weight of my mistakes on my shoulders. For the next year, I wandered aimlessly. I worked in hostels, in cafes, anywhere that would allow me to earn enough to keep moving. Each new city, each new face, was an opportunity to forget, if only for a moment, the damage I had caused. But the past has a way of catching up with us, no matter how far we try to run. In every relationship I tried to form, in every connection I tried to make, the ghost of what I had done lingered. I knew I could not move on until I faced it and found some form of redemption. It was then that I decided to return to my hometown of Denver, the place where I had grown up, where my parents still lived, where the roots of my identity were deeply planted. I arrived on a crisp fall afternoon, with the leaves falling around me as a reminder of the passage of time and the changes that had occurred in my life. My parents greeted me with a mixture of relief and concern. They knew some of what had happened, but not all. I told them my story without holding back, letting the tears flow freely as I confessed my mistakes. To my surprise, they did not judge me. They hugged me, offered their unconditional love, and told me they were proud of me for finding the courage to face my past. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life in the city. I got a job at a small neighborhood bookstore, a quiet place where I could lose myself in other people's stories while reflecting on my own. Books became my companions, my teachers. Through them, I began to understand my actions, my motivations, and the complexities of the human heart. It was not easy. There were days when the weight of my memories crushed me, when guilt threatened to drown me. But there were also moments of clarity, of understanding. I began to see that while my actions were wrong, my feelings were real. I had sought love and connection in the wrong places, but that didn't make me a bad person. Over time, I dared to make new friends in the city. At first, I was afraid that my past would catch up with me, that rumors about what I had done would reach here. but I found that people were more interested in who I was now than who I had been. Gradually, I began to feel part of a community again. One afternoon, while selecting books in the bookstore, I came across a novel that told a story surprisingly similar to my own. I read it in one sitting, feeling a deep connection with the protagonist. When I finished it, I made a decision. I would write my own story. I began to write every night, pouring my experiences, emotions, and reflections onto the page. It was not easy to relive certain moments, but I found that the act of writing had a cathartic effect. As the words flowed, I felt as if I were releasing a weight that I had carried for a long time. As I wrote, I also began to wonder about Richard and Jacob. What had happened to them? Had they managed to reconcile? Curiosity and the need to close this chapter of my life led me to make another difficult decision. I would contact them. First, I wrote to Richard. The letter took me days to complete. I wanted to express my sincere regret, ask for forgiveness without making excuses, and at the same time not reopen old wounds. Finally, I sent it, not knowing if I would receive a response. To my surprise, Richard wrote back. His letter was brief but kind. He told me that he had left the farm, that he now lived in the city and worked as an agricultural engineer. He had found a new partner and was trying to rebuild his life. His words were not full of forgiveness, but they were not full of bitterness either. He wished me well and thanked me for having the courage to reach out. Reaching out to Jacob was even harder. Part of me worried that my feelings for him might resurface, but I knew I needed this conversation to move on. I wrote him an email asking if we could talk on the phone. The call was intense and emotional. Jacob told me he had sold the farm shortly after I left. He couldn't bear living there with all those memories. He had moved to a coastal town where he now worked as an agricultural consultant. He said he had tried to reconcile with Richard, but their relationship was still strained. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the good and the bad, crying and laughing at times. In the end, we both acknowledged that our affair had been a mistake, but also that it had been real. We said goodbye with a mixture of sadness and relief, knowing that this was the true end of our story. These conversations, though difficult, helped me close an important chapter in my life. I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could learn from it and use it to build a better future. I continued writing my story, now with a new perspective. It was no longer just a tale of betrayal and guilt, but also of growth and redemption. As the pages filled, I felt like I was creating something more than just a book. I was creating a testament to my personal journey, a guide for others who might find themselves in similar situations. One day, while walking through City Park, I ran into Emma, an old schoolmate. We met, and when I told her I was writing a book, she was genuinely interested. She worked as an editor at a local publishing house and encouraged me to send her my manuscript when it was ready. Months of hard work followed, writing, rewriting, and revising. Every word was carefully chosen, every scene meticulously constructed. Finally, with my heart in my throat, I sent the manuscript to Emma. The weeks of waiting were agonizing. I wondered if I had done the right thing by publishing my story like this. What if people would judge me? What if Richard or Jacob found out and felt betrayed all over again? When Emma called to say they wanted to publish my book, I felt a mixture of joy and terror. It was a dream come true, but it also meant that my story, with all its imperfections and mistakes, would be there for the world to see. The process of publishing my book was an emotional roller coaster. Every step, from editing to designing the cover, forced me to relive different aspects of my experience. But with each phase, I felt a little lighter, more at peace with myself. The day of the book launch arrived faster than I expected. The small bookstore where I worked organized the event, and to my surprise, it was packed. There were familiar faces, my parents, friends from the city, even some regular customers, but there were also new faces, people who had heard about the event and were intrigued by the story. As I read a passage from the book, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer the frightened, guilt-ridden woman who had returned to the city years ago. I had become someone who had faced her demons and found the strength to tell her truth. The audience asked a variety of questions. Some were curious about the details of the story, others were interested in the writing process. But the question that impacted me the most came from a young woman in the back of the room. "How did you find the strength to forgive yourself?" she asked, her voice trembling. I took a moment before answering, aware that my response could be important not just for her, but for many others in the room. "Forgiveness," I began, "is not something that happens overnight. It's a process, a journey. For me, it started when I stopped running from my mistakes and decided to face them. Writing this book was part of that process. It forced me to look honestly at my actions, to understand my motivations without making excuses. But most importantly, it helped me realize that while I can't change the past, I can learn from it and use it to be a better person in the present and future." As I spoke, I noticed tears in the eyes of some audience members and knew that my words had touched something deep within them. Perhaps, I thought, this was the true purpose of sharing my story, to help others find forgiveness and redemption in their own lives. After the launch, as I signed books and talked with readers, I felt overwhelmed by the warmth and support I received. Many people shared their own stories of mistakes and second chances with me. I realized that by exposing my vulnerability, I had created a space where others felt safe to do the same. In the months that followed, I received numerous emails and letters from readers across the country. Some thanked me for my honesty. Others shared how my story had given them hope in their own struggles. Each message reminded me that while our actions can have painful consequences, there is always a path to redemption if we are willing to do the hard work of confronting ourselves. One day, while organizing books at the bookstore, I received an unexpected call. It was Richard. My heart raced at the sound of his voice. "I read your book," he said after a moment of awkward silence. I braced myself for the worst, fearing that he might be angry about how I had exposed our story. "I wanted to tell you that it helped me understand a lot of things," he continued. "It wasn't easy to read, but I think it was necessary. Thank you for your honesty." Tears streamed down my face as we talked. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a step toward mutual understanding. Richard told me that the book had given him the courage to talk to his father, to try to rebuild their relationship. "It's not a fairy tale ending," he said, "but we're working on it." That conversation made me realize something important. True redemption isn't just about forgiving ourselves. It's also about repairing, as much as possible, the harm we've caused to others. I couldn't undo my past actions, but I could use my experience to help others heal. Inspired by this idea, I began offering therapeutic writing workshops at the bookstore. Each week, a diverse group of people would come together to write about their experiences, struggles, and hopes. Seeing how writing helped them process their emotions and find clarity in their lives filled me with a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. As time went on, I felt like I was writing a new chapter in my own life, one centered on growth, compassion, and service to others. I no longer defined myself by my past mistakes, but by what I was doing to make a positive impact in the present. One day, as I was walking through town, I stopped in front of the church where I had married Richard years ago. Instead of the pain and guilt I used to feel when I saw that place, I felt a sense of peace. Not because I had forgotten what had happened, but because I had learned to integrate it into the larger narrative of my life. I realized that each of us is an ongoing story, filled with good and bad chapters, with triumphs and failures. The important thing is not to have a perfect story, but to learn from each chapter and use those lessons to write a better future. As I walked away from the cathedral, I felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. My story was not over. In fact, I felt like it was just beginning. And this time I was determined to write it with wisdom, compassion, and love, not only for others but also for myself. Now, as I write these final words, I look to the future with a mixture of excitement and serenity. I don't know exactly what lies ahead, but I know that I am ready to face it with all the lessons I have learned and all the strength I have gained. My journey of redemption is not over, and perhaps it never will be completely over. But I have learned that it is okay. Life is not about achieving unattainable perfection, but about continually growing, learning from our mistakes, and using our experiences to help others. To all those who struggle with their own past, with their own mistakes, I say this: there is hope. The road may be hard and long, but it is worth the journey because in the end, You will discover that you are stronger than you ever imagined, more resilient than you believed possible. And to myself, to the Emma who began this journey so many years ago, I say, you did well. You faced your demons, learned from your mistakes, and found a way to use your pain to help others. I am proud of you. As I close this chapter of my life, I look forward with hope and determination. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I am ready to face it, to keep growing, to keep loving, because after all, that is what life is all about. Loving, learning, and growing, no matter how many times we stumble along the way. And so, with a heart full of gratitude for the lessons learned, I close this chapter of my story, but with the knowledge that every ending is just the beginning of something new. I am ready more than ever to see what the next chapter holds.